In 2017, Tennessee doctor Paul Locus was celebrating Halloween dressed as the Joker when he got an emergency call that one of his patients was in labor. Still wearing full makeup, green hair, and a purple suit, he rushed straight to the hospital to deliver the baby. The mother later said she couldn't stop laughing as her baby entered the world in the hands of a Batman villain. Here's a photo of a Turkish soldier whose face was severely disfigured by artillery fire during the Battle of Gallipoli in World War I. He likely didn't survive long enough for any meaningful reconstruction to be attempted. In the 1830s, Spanish-born criminal Diogo Alves terrorized Lisbon by robbing travelers on the city's aqueducts and throwing dozens to their deaths below, earning him the nickname the Aqueduct Murderer. After later killing a wealthy family during a botched robbery, he was caught and hanged in 1841. Scientists then severed his head and preserved it in formaldehyde for study, where it still sits on display at the University of Lisbon, eerily intact nearly 2 centuries later. A shocking medical scandal is unfolding in Austria, where a neurosurgeon is facing criminal charges for allegedly letting her 12-year-old daughter drill a hole into a patient's skull during emergency brain surgery. The unconscious patient had suffered traumatic head injuries and needed a burr hole to relieve pressure, yet prosecutors say the surgeon handed the drill to her daughter and let her perform the procedure herself, despite the child having zero medical training. The girl never should have been inside the operating room in the first place, as strict hospital protocol forbids minors or unauthorized personnel from being present during sterile surgeries, let alone touching the equipment, let alone drilling into patients' skulls. The patient was never informed a child would be involved, and only discovered the truth months later after an anonymous tip led to an investigation. The hospital immediately fired the surgeons involved, and the lead doctor is now on trial for causing bodily harm and abusing her position. Although the patient survived, he reportedly still suffers long-term effects, and the court called the doctor's decision a catastrophic breach of trust and professionalism. This is real footage of the most dangerous object humans have ever created, the elephant's foot inside the ruins of Chernobyl. It looks like a lump of rock, but it's actually corium, a molten mixture of uranium fuel, concrete, steel, and reactor parts that fused together when Reactor 4 tore itself apart in 1986. When this mass formed, it was so radioactive that standing near it for a mere few seconds delivered a fatal dose. In those first few hours, the elephant's foot wasn't just deadly to anyone who approached. It was still hot enough chemically and thermally that if it had burned through the foundation and hit the water reservoirs beneath the plant, it could have triggered a massive steam explosion. Soviet scientists warned that the blast would have torn open the remaining reactors and sent an uncontrollable cloud of nuclear fallout across most of Europe, rendering entire countries uninhabitable. The only reason that didn't happen is because liquidators, many of whom died horribly later on, managed to drain the water and seal the lower levels in time. Early attempts to photograph the elephant's foot were catastrophic. The radiation shredded camera film and interfered with electronics, leaving warped, blistered images where the object barely looked real. Simply entering the corridor meant almost certain death for the human body. The footage shown comes from 1996, 10 years after the accident, where the radiation had dropped just enough for a brief, tightly controlled visit. But it was still extremely dangerous. By then, the mass was emitting mostly alpha radiation, particles that can't penetrate skin yet become lethal if even a single speck is inhaled. The team used ventilation, masks, and moved quickly, knowing the room was still one of the most radioactive places on the planet. Nearly 4 decades later, the elephant's foot remains where it formed. It's much cooler now, but still too radioactive to touch, too heavy to move, and too toxic to ever be safely dismantled. It stands as a permanent monument to a disaster that nearly poisoned half a continent. You may have this extremely rare eye condition without even realizing it. Visual snow is a neurological condition where a constant layer of flickering static fills a person's entire field of vision, often described like television noise that never turns off. For years, it was thought to be extremely rare, partly because many sufferers never reported it, believing their vision was normal. Only recently has it been more widely recognized as visual snow syndrome, with researchers linking it to abnormal activity in the brain's visual processing areas rather than problems with the eyeballs themselves. There's currently no known cure, though some treatments may help reduce symptoms for certain patients. Some people live with the condition for decades before realizing that what they see is not how most people experience the world. Xenoturbella is a simple deep-sea organism that has no brain, no eyes, and no clearly defined organ, consisting mostly of a soft, ciliated body with a single opening used for both feeding and waste. First discovered in the 1900s, it puzzled scientists for decades because its anatomy is so minimal that researchers struggled to classify it, with debates still continuing over where it fits on the evolutionary tree. It survives by ingesting tiny organic material on the ocean floor, and for many researchers it appears to exist for no clear reason. In October of 2024, Micah Smith took his 3 young children, ages 2, 4, and 8, on a 9-mile hike in Utah that authorities described as extremely difficult and dangerous, especially as a major storm was rolling in. Court records say Smith failed to check the weather and continued climbing, even after sending photos of the incoming storm to his wife, who urged him to turn back. Investigators say he refused, later telling police he was comfortable hiking in the dark without lights. By the time they reached the summit around 6 p.m., hail and snow had started falling. The family began descending, but only made it about 600 feet before one child fell and struck their head. At that point, Smith decided to shelter in place overnight with the children, despite worsening weather and inadequate clothing. During the night, prosecutors say the children repeatedly said they were cold, exhausted, and wanted to go home. One child allegedly begged Smith to turn back earlier, saying she was afraid she might not survive, but he refused, calling the hike a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Court documents state Smith later claimed he performed CPR on his son overnight and instructed his daughter to continue the CPR before leaving his children behind. When search and rescue teams located Smith the next day, he was all alone and appeared completely unconcerned about his kids, telling responders he believed one of his children was already dead. A helicopter crew later found the 3 children together, severely hypothermic and inadequately clothed. All 3 children ultimately survived, though 2 were in critical condition, and one had a core body temperature of 63 degrees Fahrenheit that led to a stroke and emergency brain surgery. Smith was later charged with aggravated child abuse and child torture, with prosecutors requesting no bail, arguing he repeatedly chose to continue, despite warnings from the children, their mother, and the worsening weather. In April of 2026, in the village of Hagenbach in eastern France, police responded to a neighbor's report of sounds of a child coming from a parked utility van. When they opened it, they found a 9-year-old boy alive but in shocking condition, completely unclothed, lying in fetal position on a mound of trash and waste, severely malnourished with very pale skin, and muscles so atrophied from prolonged confinement that he could no longer walk or stand. The boy had been locked inside the van since November of 2024, over 16 months. To neighbors and others, he had simply disappeared, with the family claiming he no longer lived there. His 43-year-old father admitted to keeping the child confined, saying it was to protect him from his partner, who allegedly wanted to place the boy in psychiatric care. The father was charged with kidnapping and deprivation of care, while his 37-year-old partner was also charged for failing to intervene. The boy was hospitalized and his siblings were removed from the home as the investigation continues. An elementary school outing in British Columbia turned into absolute chaos on November 20th, 2025, when a grizzly bear suddenly charged a group of 4th and 5th graders from a wall to school as they paused on a riverside trail. 11 people were injured during the attack, including 2 children who were rushed to the hospital in critical condition, while 7 others were treated at the scene. Teachers fought the bear off with bear spray and a bear banger, likely preventing multiple deaths. The bear soon escaped back into the forest and has still not been found, and officials say they don't know what triggered the attack or whether the animal will strike again. What's especially unsettling is that the attack happened to a group large enough that grizzlies normally avoid entirely, suggesting something was deeply wrong with the monstrous animal. And until conservation officers track it down, the entire valley remains on edge, knowing an injured and unpredictable grizzly bear is still lurking somewhere in the shadows. In 2017, 22-year-old YouTuber Pedro Ruiz III tried to film a stunt where a hardcover encyclopedia would stop a .50 caliber round from a Desert Eagle. He had already tested the trick once before with a smaller gun, giving him the confidence to try it again, this time asking his pregnant girlfriend Mona Lisa Perez to fire from just a foot away. But the .50 cal round tore straight through the encyclopedia and into his chest, killing him instantly as 2 cameras recorded the stunt and their 3-year-old daughter stood nearby. Family members later said they'd warned him these viral stunts would get him killed. Perez pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 180 days in jail, and their unborn son was later named after Pedro. In Tampa, Florida, a long-lost cemetery quietly vanished from records for nearly a century, until a local newspaper traced old land deeds and realized a public housing complex had been built directly on top of it. When archaeologists scanned the ground with radar, they found over 100 graves still buried under the apartment complex in perfectly neat rows. The housing authority later confirmed they wouldn't disturb the bodies. Instead, they began relocating residents and announced plans to turn the land into a memorial park for the forgotten dead. In October of 2006, 18-year-old Nikki Katsouris died after crashing her father's Porsche 911 Carrera at more than 100 miles per hour on a California freeway. The impact was so catastrophic that her body remained strapped in the driver's seat, but her head was no longer attached. The scene was so graphic that the coroner advised her parents not to identify the body. But in the aftermath, 2 California Highway Patrol employees improperly leaked photographs of the accident that quickly spread across the internet, appearing on forums and shock sites. Strangers later began anonymously emailing the horrific images directly to the grieving Katsouris family. The family later pursued legal action against the California Highway Patrol, and in 2012 the state reached a settlement with them over the unauthorized release of the photos. In 1974, 6-year-old Gary Ray Hose ran away from home to escape alleged abuse from his parents. Police soon returned the boy to his household, but he was never seen again. Years later, his older brothers told investigators that their mother had beaten Gary to death shortly after he was brought back and buried his body somewhere on the family's remote desert property. Despite searches and the disturbing testimony, Gary's remains have never been found, leaving the case unresolved and the exact circumstances of his death unknown.
Princess Diana dead. Oh, she died. Where's the remote?
Oh my God.
That was the moment a group of friends accidentally recorded the exact second the world learned Princess Diana was dead. In the early hours of August 31st, 1997, Princess Diana and Dottie Fayed left the Ritz Hotel in Paris after being followed by paparazzi. Their driver sped through the city, apparently trying to lose them, and lost control inside the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, slamming directly into a concrete support pillar. The impact killed the driver and Dottie Fayed instantly. Diana was pulled from the wreck alive and rushed to the hospital, where doctors desperately fought for hours to save her. At first, reports said she was only injured, and most people couldn't even fathom the idea that she might actually die. News stations described her condition as serious but stable, and the world waited for updates, not realizing how bad it really was. At 4 a.m., French officials confirmed she had died from massive internal injuries at just 36 years old. The news spread instantly as broadcasts were interrupted, radios were stopped, and millions woke up to headlines announcing the sudden death of the most famous woman on Earth. Within hours, crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, covering the gates with flowers and letters. One man in the car did survive the crash, Diana's bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones. He was the only person wearing a seatbelt, but still broke just about every bone in his face, lost much of his memory, and later said the trauma haunted him for the rest of his life. Investigators later found that driver Henry Paul was heavily intoxicated and driving at extremely high speed. They also confirmed that Diana was not wearing a seatbelt, and experts believe that if she had been restrained, she likely would have survived. Her death became one of the largest public mourning events in world history, with over 2 billion people watching her funeral and an entire generation remembering exactly where they were when they heard of her passing. After her funeral, Diana was buried on a small island in the middle of a lake on her family's property in England. The grave is surrounded by water and trees and is not accessible to the public. This was the shocking moment when a routine health inspection turned into a chemical crime scene. At a public event in Denver on November 16, 2025, a city health inspector walked up to a Colorado food vendor and dumped bleach straight into their fresh prep bowls, guac, onions, limes, and all. The vendor had reportedly been cited for a basic violation, something most inspectors handle with a warning or a shutdown notice. Instead, this one chose to douse the food in chemicals, turning a full day's worth of meals into a toxic soup while stunned bystanders could do nothing but watch. The city is now scrambling to explain how a simple violation escalated into something so extreme. In 2024, a seemingly healthy 47-year-old New Jersey father collapsed and died just minutes after eating a hamburger at a backyard barbecue. His autopsy came back clean, no heart disease, no organ damage, no toxins, so the death was simply labeled sudden and unexplained. Months later, specialists discovered he had extremely high levels of antibodies tied to alpha-gal syndrome, the strange meat allergy triggered by Lone Star tick bites. His body had gone into a hidden anaphylactic reaction to the beef he'd eaten just fine his whole life. It's now considered the first documented fatal case of alpha-gal, proof that one unnoticed tick bite can rewire your entire immune system in a deadly way. This was the horrifying moment when Jane Goodall uncovered the savage truth behind chimpanzees. In the 1970s, Goodall and her team witnessed a shocking 4-year conflict known today as the Gombe Chimpanzee War. A single chimp community in Tanzania split into 2 rival factions, and the carnage that followed shattered the long-held belief that chimps were peaceful creatures. The war started when 6 males ambushed a lone rival and tore him to shreds, and over the next few years, the stronger group carried out coordinated raids in which every male of the weaker side was hunted down and killed in brutal fashion. Females were beaten, kidnapped, and often murdered until the losing community was completely wiped out. For Goodall, who had once described her chimps as gentle and idyllic, the violence was devastating. She admitted to having constant nightmares about the carnage and about watching individuals she had known since infancy transform into cold-blooded killers. The scientific world was equally shaken. The war revealed that chimpanzees, like humans, are capable not only of affection and cooperation, but also of organized warfare, murder, and ruthless extermination. In 1992, 16-year-old Suzanne Capper was lured to a house in Manchester by people she thought were her friends. But for nearly a week, they tortured and humiliated her, breaking her arm, pulling out her teeth, shaving her head, and scrubbing her skin off with a wire brush before forcing her into a bathtub of disinfectant. They blasted tapes of the movie Child's Play to torment her, then drove her to a field, doused her in gasoline, and set her on fire. Suzanne survived for long enough to name her attackers before dying in the hospital 4 days later. 6 people were convicted for the heinous crimes. 4 received life sentences, including 2 women who were just 17 and 18 at the time, while the 2 remaining men were given lengthy prison terms. Rampage Jackson has said that his son Raja was never the same after his mother was murdered, a little-known tragedy in their family history. The details of her death aren't publicly known, but this revelation resurfaced after Raja's violent outbursts at the Knox Pro Wrestling event, where he struck wrestler Psycho Stu with more than 20 unanswered blows, leaving the man critically injured. Rampage condemned the attack, but also pointed to the loss of Raja's mother as a turning point in his life, which may begin to explain the troubled path that led to this shocking incident. This is what a bear with rabies looks like. The good news is, the bear will most likely kill you before the rabies becomes an issue. In 2012, 2 young sisters from Tacoma, Washington suffered such severe sunburns during a school field day that they had to be rushed to the hospital. Shockingly, the burns could have easily been prevented, but the girls weren't allowed to use sunscreen because school policy required a doctor's note, treating it like a controlled drug. The incident caused outrage, and years later, Washington finally passed a law allowing students to carry sunscreen at school without medical permission. In 2018, 41-year-old British traveler Amanda Gill died from diabetes complications while visiting Mexico. But when her body was flown back to the UK, her family made a horrific discovery. Her eyes, brain, heart, and other organs were missing, with only part of her lower bowel left intact. It's believed that police or hospital staff sold her organs to traffickers. This tragic gravestone from 1875 reads, Kate McCormick, seduced and pregnant by her father's friend. Unwed, she died from abortion, her only choice. Abandoned in life and death by family, with but a single rose from her mother. Buried only through the kindness of an unknown benefactor. Died February 1875, age 21. Victim of an unforgiving society. Have mercy on us. A 44-year-old man lived nearly a decade with a knife blade buried deep in his chest without even realizing it. He felt no pain, had no breathing problems, and seemed perfectly healthy, until strange pus suddenly began oozing from beneath his nipple. Doctors finally ran scans and discovered the blade had been lodged inside his body for 8 years since a stabbing, quietly encased inside of him. Doctors removed the rusted metal in a dramatic surgery, and he walked out of the hospital just 10 days later. Wendell Middlebrooks, the actor who played Kirby on The Sweet Life on Deck, died suddenly at the young age of 36 when a pulmonary embolism tore through his lungs. He was found unconscious and alone in his Los Angeles home, likely collapsing in seconds as the blood clot blocked his oxygen, leaving him with no chance to call for help. Fans remembered him as the goofy security guard and the straight-faced Miller High Life guy, making it all the more tragic that such a wholesome presence was suddenly struck down by a silent killer lurking in his bloodstream. Some people known as bug chasers deliberately try to infect themselves with STDs, most notoriously HIV. Emerging in the late 90s, the subculture revolved around men seeking unprotected intercourse with HIV-positive gift givers. For some, the virus was fetishized as a form of erotic gift, while for others it was seen as inevitable, something to get over with instead of living in fear of. Some even viewed HIV as a mark of belonging to a special community. Interviews revealed participants craving the taboo of a slow, deadly virus invading their body, an act of self-destruction that got them aroused. This might be the most awful case I've ever covered, especially since it happened just 30 minutes from where I live. In July of 2007, the quiet town of Cheshire, Connecticut was rocked by one of the most disturbing home invasions in U.S. history, when two men followed Jennifer Hawk Pettit and her 11-year-old daughter Michaela home from the grocery store and returned that night to break into the family's house. Dr. William Pettit was savagely beaten with a baseball bat and tied up in the basement, while Jennifer and her daughters Michaela and 17-year-old Haley were bound upstairs and held captive for hours while the intruders roamed freely throughout the home. At dawn, Jennifer was forced to withdraw $15,000 from a bank, quietly alerting a teller that her family was being held hostage, but police who surrounded the home decided to wait rather than storm the house. Inside, the terror escalated. Jennifer was killed, Michaela was left tied to her bed after being subject to unthinkable abuse, and gasoline was poured throughout the home, on the floors, on furniture, and even on the girls themselves before the intruders set the house on fire. Jennifer's body was discovered on the first floor, while Haley and Michaela, still bound, died of smoke inhalation as flames consumed their rooms. Against all odds, William managed to escape barefoot and bloodied through the basement, crawling to a neighbor's yard as the only survivor of the family. The two attackers crashed the family's SUV while fleeing and were arrested immediately, later sentenced to death for one of the most infamous crimes in Connecticut history. Sentences eventually reduced to life after the state abolished capital punishment. Adding to the horror, one of the killers later tried to deflect blame by calling William a coward and suggesting his failure to act was the real reason why his wife and daughters died.